Hello, amazing people, and welcome to the Ryan Files. Today, we're diving into one of the most mind-blowing topics yet, the Nephilim, Ancient Giants, and the hidden history behind them. And I couldn't think of a better person to help us unpack them than my guest today, the one and only Doug Van Dorn. Doug is a pastor, author, and expert on biblical giants and ancient myths. He's written extensively on the Nephilim, the Watchers, and the supernatural worldview of the Bible, and today he's here to help us separate fact from fiction. What were the Nephilim? Did the ancient world really have giants? And why does mainstream history seem to ignore these stories? If you've ever been fascinated by Genesis 6, the Book of Enoch, and the mystery of suppressed history, this episode is going to blow your mind. So buckle up because we're about to go deep into the rabbit hole. Let's get into it. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome this week to the Ryan Files. Special guest Doug Van Dorn is joining me. Thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate you, buddy.
Yeah, Ryan. Always fun to talk about giants.
So you're the pastor of the Reformed Baptist Church of Northern Colorado. I've read some stuff. You've written many books, including Giants, Sons of the Gods, The Unseen Realm Q&A Companion, which was the companion to Dr. Michael Heiser's book, Unseen Realm, which is awesome. And a number of podcasts. I love the fact that you're a mountaineer. I love the fact that you like golf, cycling. All this stuff is awesome. Man, it's great to have you on. Thank you so much. I brought you on because I've seen so many different podcasts, interviews, whatnot with yourself with regards to this fun passage in Genesis, right out the gate, Genesis 6. We start talking to this thing about, giants in the land, the men are renowned, Nephilim, watcher angels, and you get into the Book of Enoch and all this stuff. I've been talking about it with my following here at the Ryan Files, but I thought, why not bring on a guy who is definitely the teacher in this matter, and I am the student. So I just love to just kind of talk to you about it, hear your thoughts, explain it in layman's terms for some who are just hearing it for the first time, and maybe even add a little bit more deeper context for those who are starting to really begin to understand it.
Sure.
Awesome.
Just want to dive into Genesis 6 then?
Yeah, let's dive in, man. There's so much to it. It's awesome. I love it.
Yeah. So it's 4 verses. I guess we should read it.
Yep.
When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for his flesh, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years." The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. So four short little verses, but they're like mind-blowing, world-changing verses, especially when you understand what's actually going on with it.
Yeah, and it's interesting how growing up in a Christian family, going to church and whatnot, it took me, 52 years before I really, 50 probably years before I really ever heard any of this for the first time. And even having read over it myself, even, it's just one of those things I think you gloss over because you're like, I don't know what that means.
Right.
So
in my early days as a pastor, it was the same thing. People would ask me this question about this passage, and I was like, well, I think it's probably Sethites marrying Canaanites and that kind of a thing. So that's become the popular interpretation probably for the last 1,600 years of the church.
Right.
But before that, it's a different story. So, we go back to Jesus. He's 2,000 years ago. So that means for about the first 400 years of the church. And then also in Judaism at the same time as the New Testament, things were very different in the way they understood this passage.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of, and you can see kind of, if you go back and do a deep dive on it, there's a buddy of mine, Tim Chafee from...
Yeah, I know Tim.
Yeah, so...
He's a giant of a man. The dude's like 6'10" or something. He's huge.
I talked to him, and he actually posed for a giant in the diorama that they have there at the Ark Encounter. It's awesome.
Yeah.
But Yeah, his book is fascinating on breaking down all this, but you can kind of go back and you can kind of see where that shift happened, why it happened. And obviously the three arguments are the Sethite version, the King's version, and then of course this, sons of God version.
Right. So I guess I could take you through the history of it. We can also go through what the text actually says. They're both really interesting. Maybe what the text actually says is the best to me. Start with it, start with the scripture and see what it actually tells us, and then go to other things. But
yeah, absolutely,
seems to make the most sense to me. So, like you said, there's three views out there, but what's it actually saying? So, to get as simple as I can get this. Just going through the words, when man began to multiply. So the word man there is the word for Adam. It's the same word used in the Garden of Eden. And so we know that word would refer to humanity. Okay, so that's really important. It doesn't say anything else there about anyone else. It's just the word Adam, and we translate it as man or mankind. All right, so then the second key thing there is, as they're multiplying on the land, the daughters were born to them. Okay, so mankind is having daughters, and they're being born to them. So really important, again, just for establishing what it's saying that the daughters are born to humanity.
Right.
Okay? All right. I know that kind of seems pedantic or something, but when we start talking about the other views, that will become really, really important for stating what I would think would be the obvious when you just read it.
Right.
Okay, so then the third thing is it introduces another group. These are called the sons of God. So they see that the daughters of man are attractive. So the question becomes, who are these sons of God? And it would appear just from the immediate context that they have to be different from Adam, from men. Sons of God are somehow different from men because they're a different group, right? If all of mankind is assumed under the word man, then whatever the sons of God are, they would have to be something other than that.
Right.
So they see that the daughters of man, again, so it's re-emphasizing that point, are attractive, and they take them as their wife, and they choose. That taking, by the way, can refer to, it could be just giving in marriage, like kings to kings or something like that, royalty handing a daughter over to be married. Or that word is sometimes actually used for like kidnapping, raping, that sort of a thing. So it could be either of those. And to me, it doesn't make that much difference, but it's interesting to think about the options. Okay, so verse 3 is really not part of this present discussion, Ryan, but it's interesting because it says man's days will be 120 years, and people will often wonder, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And I believe that refers to how long it will be from the time of this prophecy until the destruction of the world. So it's not talking about, like, a lot of people will say, oh, well, that refers to how long men are going to live later on. Like, God is cutting down their age span, because if you look at the genealogies before the flood, they're living like 900 years. But after the flood, by the time you get to Moses is 120 years when he dies. The problem with that, of course, is that there's a lot of people between Moses and the flood that are living a lot longer than that. So makes the most sense that what that's referring to is that in 120 years, God's going to destroy the earth.
All right. So this is like a pre-warning of the flood.
Exactly. And it sets up the Noah story, which follows immediately on the heels of these 4 verses, right? Because he's going to build an ark. And I've thought about that now. Like, he's going to spend 120 years building an ark. That's crazy. But it's a big boat, and he's got just, a couple people to work on it. So I guess it makes sense.
Gotcha. Yeah, for sure. And if you ever seen that at the Ark Encounter, Lord Almighty, that's a big boat.
And we were there just before they had finished building it, 15 years ago. So I have never got to see it, but I really wanted to.
I just went in January, and I can't imagine in the summer how busy it is, but it is fascinating. It is fascinating. I really enjoyed it. But anyways, that's a different subject for another day. So, okay, so now we're beyond the 120 years. I know, like, there's multiple takes on that. I don't know that is necessarily like the big paramount point of this passage. That can be debated, I think, and
right.
I don't have a strong feeling. I guess maybe either way, but I do have some thoughts on it. But it's kind of irrelevant to what actually we're talking about. These,
Yeah, it's kind of it's almost a parenthetical to the storyline that the four verses are talking about. So you come to verse 4, and now you get your fourth group of entities that are here. So you have man, daughters of man, sons of God, and now the Nephilim, right? So the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. And I think that what that refers to is that they were there before the flood and they were there after the flood. Okay. People take a different view of that, but that to me makes the most sense because the word does appear again one other time after the flood at the end of Numbers 13, meaning that they were there in the land, and that will become relevant for something I'll tell you here in a minute. So it says, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, they bore children to them. These were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. So my interpretation of it is that the Nephilim are the mighty men who are of old, the men of renown. Some people will say, no, Nephilim are a different group than that. When you come to so there's a translation of the scripture, of the Hebrew scripture that took place 200 years before the New Testament in Greek, and they call it the Septuagint. And the Septuagint translates the word Nephilim at the beginning of the verse, and then the mighty men, this is the word Giborim, they translated the exact same word, which is the word gigantus, which in Greek is a giant. So two Hebrew words with one English word, they're trying to say, look, it's the same group of people. And they're giants. So that becomes the huge question, the two huge questions of the text. Well, I guess there's all four huge questions, but who are all these people?
right.
So the Nephilim, a lot of people think that this word comes from a Hebrew word, nephal, so Nephalim, and that word means to fall. So they'll say this is the fallen ones. The problem is that when you go to that other passage, the only other verse that's meant, the Nephilim are mentioned anywhere in the Bible, Numbers 13:33, the word appears twice. One time it's spelled exactly the same way as it's spelled here, but there's a second time in the verse that's spelled a little bit differently. And it has an extra yod or the letter Y in it. And the reason why that's so significant is because there's no way to account grammatically for Nephilim to come from the word nephal with that spelling. However, you can account for it if it's an Aramaic word that's being brought into the text. So Aramaic and Hebrew are very, very similar languages. In fact, they have almost the same exact alphabet. And that word in Aramaic actually means a giant. So when the Septuagint translates it as giant, they know what they're talking about. They don't say the fallen ones, they say the giants. So that confirms that these guys are giants. Okay, so now the question becomes, how do you get giants? Why would there be giants? Okay, so the answer to that is found in who are these sons of God. And that kind of takes you to the different views, the three different views of what the passages that you brought up at the beginning. So sounds like you grew up with the same one I did, which is like Sephites or something like that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so the idea there is that I look at it this way. It's basically Christians marrying non-Christians. They're kind of reading later passages back into this. And there's all kinds of reasons why they do that. I'll tell you what I think is the most nefarious one when we kind of finish the little discussion here, because it's kind of crazy and really relevant. But the Sethite view became popular in the church through the church fathers Augustine and Chrysostom, who were contemporaries living about 400 AD. And they really changed the view. I don't think they did it intentionally. I've looked into this rather extensively. I don't think they did it intentionally. I think that the view was lost over probably the preceding 50 to 70 years before that. And again, there's a reason why, but they started to say that this is just kind of ordinary unions and Christians marry non-Christians, and they never actually really deal with how you get giants being born from that kind of a union. That doesn't make a lot of sense, right?
Exactly. Yes.
So the older view, and again, in my mind, this is really, really significant. A scholar by the name of Yap Dodens did his PhD dissertation on this passage, and he looked up every known text from the ancient world that talks about it, and he wrote about it, put about 110 pages into it, that particular part of the dissertation, and he discovered that every single Jewish interpretation prior to the 2nd century AD took a supernatural view of the sons of God, and every single interpretation in the church did the same thing, with the exception of possibly one, but I would say no, until about 350 AD, or that is 100 years longer than America's been a country.
Right.
They all took a supernatural view. And so the question is, like, where does that come from? So that comes from the phrase, the sons of God. So that phrase occurs about 10 times in the Old Testament, and it's technical language. It's a technical description of heavenly beings, or what are sometimes called the watchers in some of the books, like Enoch. They're sometimes called the Elohim, which we translate that as gods. The Septuagint will sometimes call them angels. Best place to see this is in the book of Job. If you go to Job 38, verse 7, we'll talk about God's questioning Job. And, where were you, Job, when I laid the foundations of the earth and sunk its bases in the pillars in the ground and all this stuff? And the answer is, you were nowhere, because I hadn't even made humans yet. And yet, it says in verse 7, the morning stars were singing and the sons of God were shouting for joy. So if sons of God there are human beings, you have to have humans shouting and singing and praising God before they're even created.
Right. we got a time machine problem here. Yeah. So
you got a major time machine problem. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So obviously, whatever it is not going to be man.
Yeah. I mean, if you have, whether it's coming through physical relations with angels and women, or it's coming through genetic manipulation, whatever it is, it's not going to be man. I think any of those are open to how it actually happened. But what happened is that there were heavenly beings that were involved with somehow these Nephilim coming on the earth. And all of a sudden that becomes like, wow, mind blower and explanatory of the whole pre-flood earth and all the megaliths and all the stuff that, such a mystery that so many people like to look into. This kind of begins to explain what happened, and it puts on it a spin that the other mythologies don't put on it, which is that this was not a good thing. This was not a golden age. This was a horrible thing. And these creatures were evil and violent and wicked and perverse and all that kind of stuff.
So let me just back up for a second. And correct me if I'm wrong, Doug. It feels like the moment that you get to this, and I understand, man, it can be a little bit of a mind juggle to kind of go through all these different things, because there's arguments and all kinds of stuff. I mean, there's literally arguments by some, church fathers who just didn't believe it because they just thought it was too disgusting to talk about.
Yeah, ridiculous. They actually, that's their argument, is that that's too absurd. I couldn't believe it. That's their argument. Not a good argument.
Yeah. And so, but once you kind of get your head wrapped around that this thing happened, all of a sudden it opens up a kind of a floodgate of other things, and not only a floodgate of other things, but maybe the way we can now perceive other events in the Bible. And I mean, from, the flood all the way to our modern day, and how this moment in time had an impact throughout the Bible, and like I said, throughout modern day, and probably into the end times, and how this thing all comes to a conclusion. It's all in there.
Yeah, possibly. When I wrote the Giant book, I wanted to really focus on things up through the first coming, because I think a lot of people, they want to go to the second coming. What's going to happen in the end of days? And to me, it's actually much more interesting to see what Jesus has already done to these creatures as he's battled them throughout the Old Testament on into the New Testament. Not to kind of freak people out, because they're like, there's giants in the New Testament. And the answer is, yeah, there are, but they're not who you think they are. it doesn't say the word giant, but rather it calls them the unclean spirits of the Gospels. So whenever somebody is possessed by a demon, again, just like the interpretation of this was supernatural, everybody in the early church and the Jews as well believe that the unclean spirits, the origin of those, is that they're the disembodied Nephilim. So when a Nephilim died, whether it's in the flood or just of natural causes or was killed or whatever, when it died, because it had a heavenly parent and it had an earthly parent, it didn't go to heaven or hell. It went and just went in between, in the space in the air. And this is why you'll see Jesus saying that these creatures haunt the air. When he says that they look for dry places, that's kind of a hearkening back to the flood, because they don't want to be, drowned again. The story of Legion, where he's like, Jesus cast out the legion of demons, and they're like, don't throw us into the abyss. Let us go into the herd of pigs. The same exact sort of a thing. And which is funny, because then the pigs end up drowning in the abyss anyway, and they get exactly what they deserve. But
so essentially, okay, so we have these watchers come down. However, it's done through an actual sexual way, or if it's genetic manipulation, whatever it is, you have offspring. Those offspring are the watchers. The watchers are the giants, the men of renown.
No. So the watchers are the fathers, and the Nephilim are their children. A lot of people actually think that. So it's very common. It's actually a good slip of the tongue for you there, because it lets you correct a notion, because a lot of people think that a fallen angel is a demon. That's not true. A fallen angel is the father of the demons through the union with the women.
Thank you so much. I have been struggling to find anyone who will say definitively what the difference is between a fallen angel and a demon.
Right.
And so
you can think of it like this way, Ryan. Angels have bodies. Demons don't. They're disembodied. How do I know that? Well, look at the story in Genesis 18, for example, where 3 men come to Abraham. And then in the next chapter, 2 of them go to Sodom and Gomorrah, and they're called angels. And then the other one is actually called Yahweh, because he's the angel of the Lord. So 3 angels come to Abraham, and what do? They eat food with him. They walk into tents with him. They have face-to-face conversations with him. They have their feet washed, because they have bodies. Demons don't have bodies, and this is why it's because they've been disembodied through the process of death. And that's why they seek to inhabit other things, because it's like they're trying to get back to where they were when they were alive on the earth.
Right. And so throughout the Bible, or history, I guess you could say, when you see certain statues, for example, idols being possessed, is that a demon inside of that statue?
Yeah, great question. So, and this is also big confusion with a lot of people. A lot of people confuse the gods with the idols. And they'll say that, so what they'll do is they'll say, well, an idol is nothing, so therefore a god is nothing. A god doesn't exist because idols are just pieces of wood. What they're not understanding is that an idol is actually a house in which, through magic and incantation, you would cause the supernatural entity to come and dwell, so that you could then so the idol then acts like a mediator, right? So that you're safe from its power, and you can talk to it, and it can give you stuff, and you give it worship and all that kind of stuff. It's like a neutral place where you can have a relationship with a very dangerous creature. So what inhabits idols? I would say that because it's a house, most of the time what you end up having inhabit those are probably either the gods themselves, so like a Zeus or a Hera, which would be like a watcher, or it could be a dead ancestor, because people wanted to keep them close for all kinds of weird necromancy, netherworld purposes. And maybe an unclean spirit, although I think most people would say those are not things you really want to mess around with at all, because they're totally evil. So probably not a lot of unclean spirit demons in that sense, but demon in the broader sense of the gods themselves, Yeah, that's what inhabits the idols.
Interesting. Interesting. So here we are. We now, after Genesis 6, live in a world that, and I think this goes back, and I think we're probably going to get into the Book of Enoch 1 with this, because there's so many parallels. We know that Enoch 1 talks about this whole, kind of blows up the whole version of Genesis 6 and kind of gives you a backstory and all that. Obviously, Enoch 1 is not, part of the Bible, but it's, apocryphal, or whatever you want to call it, extra biblical text. What's your thoughts on the Book of Enoch? And with regards to, we know that it is mentioned in the New Testament, it's referred to in Jude and whatnot. And I understand that there's a number of apocryphal texts out there that are valid when it comes to using them as historical references.
Yeah, exactly.
Understanding the times, so to speak. What's your thoughts on it? And I mean, the Book of Enoch, it gets funky, real quick.
It does. So
kind of wild.
Yeah, the brief history of First Enoch. So there's a whole genre of Enochian literature. So we have First Enoch, Second Enoch, and Third Enoch. There might be others out there, but those are the main three. First of all, they're not even written close to the same time with each other. And more importantly, for First Enoch, scholars believe that it was actually probably 5 different books that were then stitched together to make one codex or one book. Kind of like the Bible is 66 books, but when you put them all in one book, it becomes the Bible, right?
Right.
So when when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1948, they found a bunch of Enoch texts, but one of those 5 books was not present there, which means that kind of corroborates the idea that First Enoch is actually a bunch of different books. And I think that becomes interesting for why the church never recognized it and why the Jews never recognized it as canon. Because when you say First Enoch, it's like, well, which ones of the books of First Enoch are you talking about, right?
Yeah.
So the book that we normally think of with regard to the Genesis 6 story is the first 36 chapters of First Enoch, and they call that the Book of the Watchers. And that's by far the oldest of the Enochian material. In my opinion, that's probably giving as close to oral tradition as we get. And they just decided for whatever reason to start writing it down so that it wouldn't be forgotten, would be my guess. My view of non-biblical literature is that people should read it. They should read it. But you don't get scared off by chapters and verses thinking you're reading the Bible. Use your head when you're reading it. Use it like you would any kind of a reference guide, like if you're reading a commentary to the Bible, that kind of a stuff, where you're not presupposing things about it that it's not even claiming to be itself. And when you do that, then it becomes very informative, and it can teach you things. But I don't know why this is, Ryan, but a lot of people think that if it's not in the Bible, it can't be true. But that's not what the Bible isn't the Bible because it's the only true book that ever was written. It's the Bible because it tells us it gives us the only certain sure knowledge for how God saves us and how he wants us to live our life. And we don't need anything else to tell us that. But that doesn't mean that if a book comes along with 36 chapters telling you about the Watcher story, that it's lying about it, because we're dealing with something that's beyond the scope of the basics of what I need to be saved. And the Bible's already said everything that you need to know about this story in order to be saved and to obey God with your life. So I look at Enoch, a very, very precious book, something that, people should sit down and read. And if they do, they'll be really kind of blown away by what's inside of it.
It's a wild ride. It's a wild ride.
It's a wild ride.
So, and I said all that to say this: these giants, the Nephilim, the giants, and it says they were in the land then and afterwards. This is kind of referring to, I believe, after the flood. The flood was sent to destroy.
Right.
And it was it sin? Was it man? Was it this race of giants that are, genetically impure and perhaps even can't be saved, not redeemable, so to speak. Is that kind of the case? You see later, I think in Matthew, where it's like all manner of flesh was corrupted. Does that mean, we're talking animals, we're talking plants, are we talking,
right.
Are we talking chimeras? Are we talking cryptids? What are we, it's like, wow. Cause then all of a sudden, Doug, you find yourself in this Lord of the Rings universe almost.
Yeah, you do.
It's kind of crazy.
That's not an accident. Tolkien knew what he was talking about. He read the myths, he knew the stories, and he created his own based on those. So as far as the flood, why did God destroy the earth? Well, no doubt it's because humanity, the sons of Adam, were evil. And it says that. And it says it twice in the most direct way you can. Like every intention of his heart is only evil all the time. That's about humans. But at the same time, it also says, and all flesh on earth had corrupted itself. And so God doesn't spare anything, except maybe, I guess, the fish, but because they're in the water, right? But all the land-dwelling things, so that would be all the animals, the Nephilim, the humans, they're all destroyed. And yeah, that does lead to some interesting questions that certainly books like Enoch and Jubilees and Jasher, the older book of Jasher, they all kind of talk about how there was weird stuff going on, not just with humans, but with animals. And not just bestiality, but it seems like they were doing stuff that created chimeras. A chimera is a kind of a mixture of a human, a god, an animal, that kind of stuff. So this is where, if you know your C.S. Lewis, like when in the scene with Aslan, where he's on the table getting ready to die, all these chimeric creatures like the Minotaur and the Centaur and the Satyrs, all these things are around that table mocking him and ridiculing him. Well, what are those things? So those are demigods according to the pagans, but in a biblical worldview, they're demons. When they die, it's kind of like the same thing happens with their soul. Like they haunt the air. They get all kinds of weird, blurry creatures, as my friend Nate and Luke like to call them on their podcast. So
I went down to Peru with them.
Oh, did you? Oh, cool.
In 2023 with Tim.
Yeah.
And that was an awesome time. They're fun guys. So here we are, 2025, many years later, and you hear we're going from all this back in the day, and this world that was kind of like you said, Tolkien-esque. And now here we are today. You hear rumors of giants.
Uh-huh.
You hear rumors of giants being, skeletons being ferried away. You hear, though, the legends of North America, Native Americans. You hear them all over the world. You see megalithic structures. Were these giants responsible for some of that stuff? Did they exist? Have they always exist? Do they still exist today? You hear about the giant of Kandahar, allegedly.
You're right, yeah.
You hear that the Smithsonian hides all the bones of the giants. They confiscate them, and oh no, there was no giant. You see pictures. You see old pictures that get scrubbed all the time from the internet. You see, though, old pictures of, alleged large skeletons and bones being found in archaeological digs. What is this, something that is still around, or is this just abnormality that maybe this one had gigantism and it has nothing to do with Genesis 6?
Wasn't it funny that just first of all we presuppose that giganticism has nothing to do with being a Nephilim? Well, why presuppose that? Maybe it does have something to do with that. I think about a guy like Andre the Giant. Of any human that's lived in my lifetime, there's been bigger guys, there's been taller guys, but Andre, he just he had the rumble in his voice. He had everything about him that makes me go, this is something that if I was to picture what a Nephilim looked like, it would be something like Andre. The question is, were these, obviously they were there before the flood. When I wrote my giant book, what I wanted to do was detail all the biblical references that I could find with the giants that are actually physically present in the Old Testament. Probably the most famous one is Goliath. People don't realize that he's actually, technically speaking, he's a Nephilim. Now, he's called a son of Rapha, and Rapha is a word where we get the word Rephaim, and Rephaim and Nephilim are basically synonyms in the scripture. There's groups called like the Anakim, and the Jebusites had giants related to them.
A lot of the
Amalekites, a bunch of the Eames, the Zuzim, the Emim, in Deuteronomy chapter 2, Genesis 14. So what you see is that in the Old Testament, after the flood, there's all kinds of tribes of these, and they're hanging around the Promised Land mostly, obviously because that's where it's written. Deuteronomy 2 talks about how the nations around Israel, so Edom and Ammon and Moab, and those people had already destroyed the Nephilim that were in their territories, and now Israel is kind of last. Like they're the last hangover here in the land of Canaan, and so you're going to go and destroy them. While they're actually there, there's a giant called Og, who's actually probably much more famous than Goliath ever was, but for whatever reason, we don't really even know he was a giant. The dude had a bed that was like 13 feet long.
It's made of steel too, right?
Yeah, something like a crazy thing. So here's what you need to know with regard to your question. So they're there physically in the land of Canaan, and then when you come to Moses and then Joshua cleanses the land and kicks them all out. But like it makes a point to say some of them were left alive in Ashdod and Gath. Why would it tell you that? Well, because that's where Goliath is going to come from later on. He's from Gath. But we shouldn't get it in our mind that he obliterated and utterly annihilated and caused them to go into extinction. No, he killed them. He kicked them out of the land, but they went somewhere, right? Where'd they go? Well, they seem to have first gone to the island of Cyprus, or maybe took a boat and went up into France and Germany, ancient Gaul, and then they migrated. They went back down south into Turkey. They went up north into Britain. And at some point in time, as they come into these lands, the people that are living there, they have wars with them. And the same thing happened with Joshua. And the people get the upper hand and they kill these people. And then at some point, they like run out of land. You're at Western Ireland. Where else are you going to go?
Yeah.
Well, the answer is you cross the sea and you come over to the Americas. That's where you're going to go. And there's reasons why the post-flood megalithic stuff that we find in the Americas with the mounds and the serpents and all this kind of stuff, it looks exactly like the stuff that you find in Britain and Ireland. It's because they're made by the same people.
Yep. Same technology. Yeah.
And these are giants. And I tell this story in my book of a woman named Sarah Winnemucca. So she was a Indian, like the first Indian woman to write a biography. She writes this biography in like 1890 or something like that. And in the book, she tells a story how she lived her people came from Nevada. They lived in Nevada. And what was then not as arid as it is today, had big giant lakes and stuff like that. And she had this red hair that had been passed down to her from who knows how long. And the story was that her people were at war with the giant tribe that was there. And they ended up getting the giants into a cave and then burning the cave, and they killed all the giants and they won. And she still had that remnant of hair. So she tells exactly where the cave is. It's called Lovelock Cave.
Oh.
And so there's a whole bunch of cool stuff with this. So 30 years later, there was some miners that came through the area, and they started digging in that cave to get all this bat guano so they could bring it back and fertilize their land. As they did that, they actually uncovered a bunch of giant skeletons in that cave. And those skeletons made it to what was called the Lovelock Museum in Winnemucca, Nevada, right off the freeway as you're going to San Francisco. And So what's crazy about that is that those bones were in that museum when I was still wrote the book. Back in 2013 is when I published it. Since then, Ryan, those bones have disappeared. They're no longer to be found. And we actually have pictures of these. And there's living people that know about these bones. They're like, yeah, somebody came from, I think, one of the Southern California universities, took the bones, and we've never seen them since.
Isn't it amazing? And that's the, whenever things, Tim Chafee and I were talking about this, when you just see the same thing over and over and over again, to the extent where it doesn't even surprise you anymore.
Yeah.
You can pretty much assume, well, there's an agenda here somehow to like, let's get these bones. We don't want people talking about giants. It kind of feels that way.
It's just wild.
Do you think giants and, you talk about the megalithic ruins and some of those similarities and whatnot. Do you think, Sacsayhuaman and these places were built by giants back in the day?
So I tend to think that probably a Sacsayhuaman is probably pre-flood.
Okay.
Especially because you think about that place, man, that's like at 14,000 foot elevation.
Yeah.
And there's like seaports that are there that makes it look like it was down at ocean level. That's crazy. So how else could it get up that high unless there was some sort of a massive tectonic upheaval of the land, right?
Yeah.
But so yeah, I think that a place like that was probably built by at least the Watchers, probably the giants.
Right.
And then when you come to post-flood stuff like the mounds and all that kind of stuff in the Americas, the pyramids, the lesser pyramids in Mexico, that kind of stuff, all of the legends, all of them from the native people are that, yeah, we didn't build these. They were built by giants.
Exactly. Yeah. It's
so when you think about, could they still be alive today? My answer is, yeah, why not? Like it hasn't been that long ago since they were here in the Americas, maybe 2,000, maybe 1,000, maybe 500 years ago. Like there's reports of even, I think it is Thomas Jefferson meeting a tribe of giants down in Florida. And he said that the two chiefs were like 8 feet tall or something like that. So there's kind of some weird reports still, even in fairly modern times, that they were there. And then you get reports of like the Solomon Islands is kind of a hotbed that you hear that there's giants still live there. I've heard those stories with Hawaii, kind of more exotic locations where, we haven't gone through and
absolutely
taking it over, whatever. So
you hear throughout history, modern day, even that bloodlines are, I don't know to what degree this is related. I think that it is in some way. Bloodlines are so important, especially maybe to the enemy.
Elite, yeah.
And these bloodlines go back to a specific watcher. It seems like, is this accurate? I mean, is this where we're getting like how this has kind of come about? I know, King Charles of England talks about how he goes all the way back to Vlad the Impaler, Dracula.
Yeah, I know, right?
In Romania. Proud of that.
Yeah, right. But it's a weird thing. There's something called the what do they call that? The divine right of the kings, especially in England. But all of the cultures had this idea that essentially in the early days, the Watchers ruled, and then they gave that rule to their sons, the Nephilim. And I think actually, going back to Genesis 6 for a minute, there's a third view of what that is, which is that the Nephilim are actually dynastic kings. And in my book, I say, okay, that's possible. Almost everybody who holds that view, and that view actually kind of was birthed with the rabbis as they desupernaturalized that passage, which ended up making its way into the church unsuspectedly in the 2nd century. And I believe that they did that because of Jesus, because Jesus was claiming to be the Son of God, which is a divine title, a heavenly being title. So look, if we can desupernaturalize sons of God, that kind of takes away that power that phrase had as all these people were converting to Christianity. But that's kind of a side note.
And he's not the Messiah now. So
because the sons of God, they're just Sethites, right? There's nothing special to see about those guys.
Very interesting. That's very interesting, actually. But yeah, so these bloodlines today, and you hear about it, especially in occult stuff, where this bloodline stuff is really important, and it's very important. It's very important that you have the best bloodline back to this watcher or whatever, Nephilim line or whatever. So it's very, very interesting that it's around still, but it's kind of hidden.
Yeah, I mean, so you asked me, is it a real thing? And my thought is, I mean, there's no way that I could ever know that with certainty, but I highly suspect that it is true, in part because of the divine right of kings. Because after the Nephilim kind of died out, or the demigods, you know, the Hercules, those kinds of guys that were around being kings, at some point, there's only really humans left, and so who do they give the kingship to? Well, very specific families is who they give it to. Why did they choose those families? Well, those families seem to all say it's because we have the divine right, because we're born into those bloodlines. So they protect those. I mean, this is the rumors, right? They protect those with their life. We're just peons. We're nothings to them because we're just mere mortals, mere humans, right?
That's interesting.
Not. Yeah.
So interesting. I mean, and as you take a step back and you look at this conversation that we just had, Greek mythology and whatnot might have some truth to it,
Yeah, it's a big one. In my mind, I've very much come to change my view of what a myth is. So sure. Growing up, you hear that myth, you hear that word, and you instantly think fiction, fable, fantasy, make-believe, tall tales, legends, not true, right? These are books that go in the fiction section. That's not what a myth is, Ryan. Myth is simply an origin story. That's all that it is. And it can be true or false, depending on the story. And when you compare Greek mythology to what's going on in the Genesis 6 story, it's exact same thing. They just use different words.
Yeah.
Right? I tell people the good example I like to use is the city of Troy. Back in the early 1800s, there was this dude who said, I want to find the city of Troy, and everybody laughed him off. He's like, that's ridiculous. Everybody knows that myths aren't true. So guess what he did? About 1860, he went over to Western Turkey, and he found the city of Troy because it was a real place. Because the myths are telling stories that maybe they're embellished, maybe, all those kinds of things you do with storytelling. But the kernel of it, the root of it, is that they actually happened.
Yeah.
There was a real person named Achilles who really fought a real guy named Hector. And it became so legendary that it became a myth.
Right.
And that became a founding story of the Trojans,
Right. And you get into other things. I mean, all of a sudden, Atlantis, and Neptune was a watcher, and the 10 kingdoms were his, Nephilim sons. And yeah, it gets kind of
no problem believing those things.
It's unbelievable. And, if you go to Greece today, they teach mythology as history. So, it kind of makes sense. This has been so enlightening, and I guarantee you my audience is going to love this. I would love to find a way to get deeper, just almost from a geeky science, standpoint of like anthropologists or, just a bone guy. I'd love to kind of figure out like this backstory behind all these bones that seem to disappear. I mean, that story that you told is unbelievable. Back in what you said, 2013, they were there and now they're gone.
They were there, but since between then they've been gone. Yep.
I just love to get a little bit more into that and maybe try to understand the reasons why it seems like this is happening, not just in the United States either. It's a worldwide
it is
phenomenon. What is there that is being hidden, I guess, is the question.
And to me, the thing that makes the most sense of why they would do this is because there was a giant hoax that was perpetrated on the people of the world that was called naturalism. And along with that came the theory of evolution, and the idea that humans are just getting better. Well, the Nephilim, everything about the Nephilim story throws a massive monkey wrench into that storyline of our origins. That became, talk about a myth, that became the origin myth that people in the 20th century just kind of buy hook, line, and sinker. It's like a scientism origin myth.
Yeah.
And so, if you have power and you're trying for whatever reasons to perpetrate that kind of a story on a bunch of people, and people keep digging up giant bones, then you're going to be the first person there to go in and find a way to get those things confiscated.
Yeah. And all of a sudden, there's such a wow factor to that, I think, and such a scoffing of the giants.
Yeah, like that couldn't possibly happen. Yeah. And I think, right, so we have thousands of mounds in this country over the course of between 1750 and about 1920 in newspapers across America about mounds in almost every state in America where they found giant bones. And in almost all of them, just, they're little newspaper writings, and they say, and so-and-so from the Smithsonian was here, and then they took the bones. And they don't say that they stole them or anything. They just are there. And it's like when you look back on it and you go, what happened to the bones? Why is the Smithsonian involved in every one of these? It doesn't take all of them to be true. It really only takes a handful of them to be true out of 1,000 different things to go, maybe something else is going on here that maybe we should investigate.
Yeah.
I mean, we're living in the age of conspiracy theories where they're all being proved true. So
exactly.
Now, even talking about this, like in 2025 is different than in 2019 where people just laugh you off. These days, people are like, yeah, that's probably true.
Yeah. Yeah. And I honestly, it's an interesting time to be alive just from that standpoint. I don't know if you call it truth, but maybe just a little bit of eye-opening is going on. So it's fascinating. Doug, I can't thank you enough, man. This has been as entertaining as it is. Just I learned stuff, and I know my audience is going to love it. Thank you so much, man.
Yeah, you're welcome, man. It's fun to talk about. It's not just something that I write about because I have to. I mean, I like to talk about it. So
awesome. And I know that you've written like over 12 books. How do people find out more about you, follow you, get your books, all of that? Because it's fascinating just talking to you. I'm sure that your books, I got to get into them as well. So how do we know more about you, what you're doing, your books, everything?
Well, the best place to go is to my website. It's douglasvandorn.com. And, I have all my books up there. My books are for sale on Amazon. It doesn't matter. Somebody asked me the other day, does it matter where I buy it? And the answer is no. I don't make any more or less money from any of those sources because it's all coming from there. But that's where you can go to see the different books that I've written on. I have about half of my books are kind of on fringy topics, and then half of them are on pretty normal topics. So I'm really trying to be a kind of a bridge to help bring a little bit more solid theological grounding to people that are in fringy spaces, and then get people that are grounded theologically to start thinking about fringy things. So, get this a two-way street. So, I mean, that's just the world that I live in. I'm a Reformed pastor, and I've started a new online paid service where people in kind of my Reformed world can go to, called the reformedfringe.com. And we've just kicked that off less than a month ago. And it's kind of a place where people are just enjoying talking about these subjects from a biblical point of view. And it can be secular things. It can be biblical things. A lot of it's really biblical stuff that people are interested in, like really taking deep dives. So people can go there. And also my church website is, our name of our church is Reformed Baptist Church of Northern Colorado. So it's the initials of that. It's rbcnc.com. And the reason why I tell people that on podcasts is because I have 23 years worth of sermons that are all there, and many of them are PDF'd, and you can just download them for free. And so people can read, if I preach on it, it's a weird topic, chances are that I've probably not skipped over it, and I've dealt directly with what I think is happening. And it's in a lot more places than people would ever imagine that it would be. So
that's awesome, man. Man, thank you so much, Doug. This is incredible, and I love your other side of you, just the mountaineering side. You climbed every mountain above 14,000 feet in Colorado.
Yeah, I have. There's 50. Well, there's 54 of them. So I finished that in 1999 because I'm an old guy, and I knew that that there was 4 peaks that they started questioning. Even back then, like, are they 14ers? Are they not? So I knew that they would pull that on me. And so today, everybody who climbs, like, there's 58 14ers. I'm like, no, there's not. There's only 54. But I climbed the other 4 anyway, because I knew that you would do this.
There you go. That's awesome. That's awesome. Out there in beautiful Colorado, my cousin of mine was in the Air Force and then in the Space Force, retired as a major. But he actually said, he's a Christian guy, but he said he actually saw a UFO out there. Have you ever seen anything crazy?
I never have, but boy, Colorado's a hotbed. There's some really wild places that are out here, especially in what they call the San Luis Valley down by Alamosa. That's called the Mysterious Valley for a reason. It's crazy down there. So
yeah, there's a number of places like that in the United States for sure.
Yeah, there are.
Well, brother, thank you so much. I cannot wait for my viewers to see this, and God bless you, man. This is awesome. Consider you a friend now, and hope to maybe someday be able to bring it back and get on some new things once I get my head wrapped around everything you said today.
Thanks for having me on, Ryan.
All right. God bless you. Doug Van Dorn. Wow, what a conversation. If this episode made you rethink history, ancient myths, or even your own worldview, then we did our job today. Doug Van Dorn brought some incredible insight, and if you want to learn more from him, check out his books and work at douglasvandorn.com. Now it's your turn. What do you think? Are the Nephilim just myths, or is there more to the story? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with a friend who needs to hear it. And if you want to go deeper into these mysteries, consider becoming a channel member or joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/The Ryan Files. We can't wait to have you. You folks are awesome. Be amazing, be positive, stay curious. And I'll see you right here next week on The Ryan Files.
Are you not curious?
Preparing to transfer the Ryan Files. Now.
I present to you, with great intrigue and wonder, the Ryan Files.